There's a moment in my life I keep coming back to. I'm in a parking lot, sleeping in my car, and I'm tapping on the window, and it's my boss waking me up. I don't remember what I said to him. Something automatic, I'm sure. Something that sounded like an explanation. What I remember is the look on his face. The look of disgust. Not angry, but disgust. He was a man that was watching something that he couldn't stop. I got straightened up, I started the car, and I drove on to the next call like nothing had happened. At that point, that was the skill I had refined above all others. The ability to keep moving while being completely absent from my life. The parking lot was not the bottom. It was like a Tuesday. It would be another 15 years before I found a solution I could actually live with. I'm Stephen, and this is Spiritual Teamwork. We use the word recovery because it's a word we have. It's not a bad word, but if we're not careful, it can shrink the things that it's trying to describe. Recovery suggests retrieval, getting back what was lost, returning to some prior condition. And there's truth in that, but it isn't the whole truth, because a lot of us, maybe most of us, don't actually want to go back to the baseline. The baseline is what we were medicating. So here's the question this show is going to keep circling from a lot of different angles over a lot of different episodes. What if recovery isn't the destination? What if it's just the door? What if most of us, and myself included, have been standing in the doorway thinking that we had arrived when there's a whole other world on the other side? That's what we're here to explore. Anthony DeMello is a Jesuit priest, and if you haven't come across him, you might want to. He was a spiritual director who had very little patience for comfortable religion. One of the things he always said was, most people are asleep. Not literally, but in the sense that we move through our days on autopilot. We react from our old patterns. We mistake the noise in our heads for reality. Never quite inhabiting the moment we're actually in. He wasn't talking about addicts, he was talking about everybody else. But those of us who've lived in the unconsciousness of active addiction, we know what he means from the inside. We got very, very good at movement that had no destination. And here's the thing I have to be very honest about. For most of the time in my addiction, I was a pastor. I was preaching on Sundays and sleeping in parking lots on Tuesdays. I didn't realize how asleep I was, which is either very ironic or very sad, probably both. The recovery tradition I came into, it actually understands this from the beginning. The founders weren't just talking about not drinking. They were pointing at something interior, and they called it a spiritual awakening. They said it was the goal, not absence as a finish line, but awakening as a direction, a movement towards something alive inside of us that the using had covered over. Here's what I've noticed in myself and a lot of people. We get clean, we get stable, we get grateful, and we stop. We treat the absence of the problem as the presence of the solution. We confuse not drowning with swimming. The mystics across traditions don't let us rest there. And I mean that as a gift and not a criticism. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor, a man who had every reason to live on autopilot, kept coming back to a single discipline. He called it returning to what's actually in front of you. Not what you fear, not what you resent, not what you wish was different, but what is. We know this move in recovery. We call it acceptance. The Stoics called it amor fati, love of what is. The Buddhists call it equanimity. The Christian contemplatives call it consenting to reality. Rather than the version we're constructing in our heads, we consent to what we see. They're different words, same sentiment. And that sentiment, the one where we're actually present for our own lives, is what I believe recovery is pointing us towards. Not as a reward for staying clean, as the reason to stay clean, as the texture of a life that becomes possible. I want to tell you about another morning. A morning I couldn't actually tell you when it was. There's no dramatic moment, no vision, no voice. Recovery didn't close the distance between who I was performing to be and who I actually was. But it gave me enough stillness to finally see how far apart they had gotten. And somewhere in that process, there was a morning where I sat in silence, and I didn't dread my own company. Maybe that was the first morning I drove in my car without having the radio on. That was, as best I can describe it, the beginning of something. Not the bottom, not some peak experience, just a quiet that felt, for the first time, like it belonged to me. That's where I think this whole journey starts for a lot of us. Not at the crisis and not at the breakthrough, but right there in the ordinary silence. The first moment we stop running long enough to notice what actually is here. That's what this podcast is for. Each episode, we'll take one thing, one theme, one practice, one question, and we'll look at it together from a few different angles. Recovery wisdom, the mystics, the contemplatives, whatever light we can gather. We will not always agree with everything we look at. We're not building a doctrine, we're building a practice. And we're doing it, I hope, as people who are honest about not having arrived, because that's the only kind of spiritual conversation worth having. So here's the question for this week. Sit with it, be open to it. What was the first moment you sensed that recovery might be pointing towards something more? Something beyond just staying clean. You don't have to have an answer. Just notice what comes up when you ask. I'm Stephen. Thanks for being here.